When I was about 5 years old, 5 or 6 or so, the house next door to our house came up for sale. And my grandmother, my dad's mom, who lived far away in a different state and was a widow, she decided that she would buy the house next door and move next door to us. And it was amazing growing up next door to Grandma. We would go over there all the time. I would spend the night at her house. We'd eat dinner over there at least once a week. But pretty early on in that new experience of Grandma living next door, I remember I'd gone over to her house one afternoon and I had been there and playing with some toys and hanging out with Grandma, and it came time for me to head home because it was getting late. And so I headed out the door, and it was then that it dawned on me, it has gotten dark while I've been here, and my parents' house is just next door, but there's no lights between here and there. And as a brave 6-year-old, I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go on my own, and I'm going to make it. And I did fine until I was about halfway there. In the flower bed at the corner of my parents' house, something moved in the bushes. Now, most likely it was just a cat or a squirrel, but I had recently watched an episode of America's Most Wanted, and I was convinced that the guy on that show was in the bushes. And I ran like I'd never run before, and I don't think that in the 34 years since that moment I've run as hard as I ran that night to get in my parents' door. And when I got through the door, I was so out of breath, my mom said, "Is everything okay?" And I said something along the lines like, "Oh yeah, I just wanted to see how fast I could get here," you know. Typically, you don't run unless there is some type of crisis or you're afraid. There's some urgent need. And unless you're a runner that you run to stay in shape or get in shape, or you're playing sports, it's probably been a while since you last ran flat out in a sprint. And if you did, it was probably because there was something incredibly important or scary happening. A flat out run is not something we do very often. I mean, if someone got up right now and walked to the back of the sanctuary, we'd be like, probably too much coffee this morning, they need to hit the restroom. But if they jumped up and ran, we'd all go, what's going on? What's happening right now? We would be alarmed. In the passage of Scripture we're going to read today, we see 3 of Jesus' disciples take off running. And it'll make much more sense to you why they are running if you recognize the moment that they're in. They've just watched their friend, their mentor, their teacher, their master, Jesus, be betrayed and arrested, tortured, and publicly executed. And they're still reeling from this when we pick up in John chapter 20 and verse 1, which says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." Now for us today, a grave typically is in the ground. And if you've been to the graveside funeral service for a loved one or a friend, you know that the casket is carried there, and then it's lowered into the ground, and then the dirt is pushed over. I want you to imagine how troubling it would be if you came back just a few days later to lay some flowers there at the tomb, the grave of your friend, and you found that it had been dug back up. You'd be getting on the phone with someone. You'd have some questions. What's going on? And so when Mary arrives and the stone has been rolled away, it's the same concept. Because Jesus was laid in a tomb, which was basically a cave that had been hewn out of the rock and then a stone rolled in front of it. And when she gets there and the stone has been rolled back and away, it's like someone has reopened this grave. So she's got questions. For that reason, verse 2 tells us, "Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved." This is how John often refers to himself in his own gospel. So she runs to Peter and John and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid them." Peter therefore went out and the other disciple and were going to the tomb. So they both ran together. And the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. And I'm sure that when Peter and John were reunited later, after Peter read this, he was like, "Really, bro? You had to let everybody know that you beat me to the tomb? We really had to include that detail? That you ran faster than me? Verse 5, and he, John, got there first, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloths lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again to their own homes. And we'll see here in a moment why Peter and John might have been more apt to leave before Mary, each for their own reasons, each for very different reasons. But Mary still has questions, she still has fears, and neither of these guys have been able to answer them, so she sticks around. Verse 11 says, but Mary stood outside the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet where the body of Jesus had lain. And they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? And Mary is so beside herself, she's so emotional, she's so distraught. Her reaction to the angels is different from just about everyone else's reaction when they come in contact with an angel in Scripture. Everyone else is terrified and afraid to speak. Mary is like someone at the counter demanding to see the manager. She says, where is my Lord? To the angels. What's going on? They've taken him away and I don't know where they've laid him. Verse 14, now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. You ever see someone that you know, but you see them in a situation that you don't normally expect to see them? I know our UPS driver, but I've seen him a couple times at different places and he's not wearing brown and I don't recognize him. And he has to go up, Scott, and go, oh, yeah, hey, good to see you. It's a different context. It's out of character. It's not what I'm expecting. When she sees Jesus, she wasn't expecting to see him alive. She's racked with grief, questions. She doesn't know what to expect. She doesn't recognize that it's Jesus. Verse 15, Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away. Mary says, listen, if we weren't supposed to put him here in this tomb, if this is not the right place, if you've carried him off somewhere, let me know so that I can make sure that my master has a proper burial. And verse 16 says, Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned to him and said, Rabboni, which is to say, teacher, master. He called her by name, and in that moment, she knew who he was. This morning, maybe it's been a long time since you ran. Maybe you aren't a runner. But I hope that you'll recognize this morning that even if you haven't headed to the gym in a while, and you're not training for some 5K that your friend has guilted you into, that we are all running. Maybe you're not running miles, maybe you're not sprinting, but you're running in a rat race. You're running to and from work. You're running back and forth between ball practices and getting kids to school, running them to their family's house, or maybe you're running from relationship to relationship, or drink to drink, party to party, experience to experience. All of this running that we do is a search. It's seeking. And what happens in this passage of Scripture is that Mary and Peter and John, they all run because they're searching for answers. They're looking. They're frightened. They're confused. They're running after answers. And what they ran to not only provided them with answers and calmed their fears, what they ran into was hope. And I want you to know this Easter, that it's possible for you to run into hope today. I want to show you this Easter that today can be the finish line of your running as you enter into hope. This Easter can be the day that you quit running. Now, I recognize that you might be here today not because you believe in all this, but because your family drug you along, or because it's Easter and you're supposed to go to church on Easter. You might be here and you're skeptical and you're trying to get through this. And if that's you, I want you to know, I'm so glad you came today. And I hope that you know that we love you and we welcome you. But I hope that you'll hear me out for a few minutes this morning. Think about it like this. Imagine if tomorrow morning when the mailman arrived, he brought a letter from an attorney. And you open that letter, and in the letter you read and learn that some distant relative, some cousin or uncle you've never heard of, has passed away and has left you his sizable estate worth millions of dollars. You'd probably be a little skeptical. I mean, this is no email from a Nigerian prince, and it's not a Facebook message from a stranger, but still it seems a little too good to be true. And so you probably approach it with some suspicion, but I guarantee you'd check it out, because the offer of that inheritance would be too great to ignore. And friend, I hope that you'll recognize this Easter that even if you have your doubts and even if you're a little skeptical, that the offer and the hope of Easter is too great to ignore. I hope you'll see that this Easter can be the finish line for you where you cross into hope. And I hope that you'll see that Easter is wonderful because it's rational. Now you might go, whoa, hold up, what are you talking about? It's not rational for someone to rise from the dead. But I want you to see that the account of the resurrection is factual, it's logical, and for that reason, it's rational. When Mary finds the stone rolled back, she reacts like anyone would in that situation. She's upset and she runs to find help. Now here's what's remarkable about that. She runs and she finds Peter and John, and they pick up in the story. But in this setting, in this culture, in first century Judea, it was an incredibly sexist and misogynistic culture. A woman could not even testify for herself in court. If she had some wrong that had been done to her that she wanted to take to court, she would have to convince her husband or her father or her brother or her son to represent her in court because she could not speak for herself. And yet Peter and John, recording what happened, tell us that the first person to come across the empty tomb and learn of Jesus' resurrection is a woman who wouldn't even be able to testify in court. The only reason for them to tell us this is if it's actually what happened. It's true. And when Peter and John hear about the stone being rolled back, they run to the tomb. And what do they notice? They notice the grave clothes, the linen cloths. This answers questions in their mind almost immediately. You see, if you're going to rob a grave, you don't take the body and leave the clothes. Especially in this setting, because the grave clothes, these linen cloths that Jesus is wrapped up in, they're wrapped with spices to help overcome the smell of decay. Maybe you don't really take notice to things that smell good. I don't really make notice of this too often. But just recently I walked into my office here at the church, and it was really like a whole crate of Bath & Body Works soaps on the table. And recently, I've heard lots of people just talk about how amazing the hand soap here smells at our church. Now, if it were up to me, we'd have like Fast Orange or Gojo, the stuff mechanics use to get grease off of their hands in the bathrooms. But the ladies saw there was a sale on Bath & Body Works, so they stocked up so we'd have the best smelling soaps here at church. And I'm glad that we all smell great and not like Fast Orange. When they wrapped Jesus' body after his crucifixion, they took expensive spices, and they wrapped it around his body to show their respect and admiration. And so if someone was going to rob the grave, the thing to take is what was left behind. It wasn't grave robbers, because if they were going to rob the grave, they would have taken what was sitting there. And it wasn't well-meaning disciples of Jesus trying to make it look like he had raised from the dead, because well-meaning disciples would not have unwrapped and therefore shown disrespect to the body of their master. If it was someone else trying to pull some type of fast trick, they wouldn't have taken the time to lay the clothes out all nice and fold the napkin. It's for this reason that when John saw this, it clicked for him. It says in verse 8, "Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed." And the word there for saw doesn't mean just to look. Doesn't mean like I see you sitting there. It means like I see what you're saying. I understand. And so when John sees the linen cloths, when he sees the grave clothes, he looked and he understood and he believed. Now, I want to point out that John isn't saying here that he understood everything, because what does the very next verse say? The very next verse, verse number 9 says, "But they did not yet know the scripture that he must rise from the dead." John isn't saying, listen, I saw that and man, I understood it all. No, he understood a little bit. He understood enough to believe. Charles Spurgeon pointed out they were clearly confused when they ran to the tomb, because if they had understood, they wouldn't have run, they would have danced. Even at the tomb, John didn't know everything yet. He didn't understand all of the details, but he believed. And friend, I want you to recognize this morning that you don't have to know it all to believe. You don't have to understand everything to believe in something. And even at this stage in my life of following Jesus, there is much I do not understand. There will be times that you might come to me and say, Pastor Daniel, I don't understand this. Why? And I would say, I don't either. And I trust that one day I will see from eternity with a new perspective, and it'll all make sense to me. I'll see as He sees, and I'll understand more. I don't see it all, I don't understand it all, but I have seen enough to know and believe. You ever looked at a photo of yourself from years ago and think, man, I was so young, and I was so thin, and I was so stupid. There's so much I didn't know yet, right? As we grow older, we learn the way of the world. And often as this reality sets in, it makes us less optimistic, less joyful, less hopeful. But this morning, I want you to know that all of that can be reversed. And because of Easter, instead of time marching on and you just growing older and perhaps larger and perhaps wiser, but also less hopeful, you can be forever young and forever hopeful because of Easter. This account of the resurrection is logical and rational. It's also personal. Mary Magdalene is the perfect person to be at the tomb, other than the fact that she couldn't testify in court because she was a woman, but because she is both sinner and saint. She's come to follow Jesus. She has been there every step of the way, trying to learn as much as she can about Jesus. She's shown her dedication, but her life before Jesus was an absolute mess. When Mark records this event, he tells us, now that when Jesus was risen early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he cast 7 devils. Now, I could take some time and go into what all that means, but basically, the short version of it, she was messed up. She was messed up like you and me. But Jesus had made her new, and her life was different now. Wherever you're at, you can find yourself in this passage today. John walks away from the tomb because he saw and he believed. He was hopeful. Mary is there at the tomb. She was both sinner and saint. Peter's story is a little more complicated. Because Peter had believed. And he believes now. And he would see Jesus resurrected and he would believe. But Peter had walked away from Jesus. The resurrection account is personal in that any and all of us can find ourselves here in the lives of Peter, John, and Mary Magdalene. But it's also personal because Jesus calls Mary by name. Mary's beside herself. She's too overwhelmed to even be scared in this moment at the fact that there are angels there before her. Then she encounters Jesus, and he appears to her in a way that she didn't expect, couldn't expect. She doesn't recognize him. He's talking to her. She doesn't even know that it's him. What changes it all? He speaks softly to her, and he calls her by name and says, Mary. Charles Spurgeon pointed out that the best and longest sermon cannot compare to the clarity that comes from Jesus calling your name. For John, it was seeing the grave clothes that brought clarity and belief. For Mary, it was hearing Jesus speak her name. And from my prayer this week has been for you, that in this service, in this moment, you would know that Jesus is calling your name. That he loves you, that he cares for you, that he speaks directly to you. And whatever the need and the story is of your heart. That just as he knew Mary's past, he knew her name, he knew every detail about her, Jesus knows the same about you, and he calls to you. For John, it was seeing the grave clothes. For Mary, it was hearing her name. But Peter's story would be a little bit more complicated. And if you look at the next chapter, you see the story of Jesus tracking Peter down. Because after everything that had happened, after Jesus had appeared to the disciples, after Jesus had demonstrated that he had risen from the dead, after Jesus had done miracles in their sight and they knew who he was, Peter had gone back to fishing. And the problem wasn't that Peter didn't believe in Jesus, because he believed in Jesus. The problem was that Peter had lost all faith in himself. And he didn't believe he was worthy to be one of Jesus' disciples. Peter had let Jesus down. On the night of Jesus' arrest and his trial, people had come to Peter and said, hey, weren't you one of Jesus' disciples? And Peter, who was the most confident and outspoken of all the disciples, says, well, not me, I don't know the guy. And on 3 occasions, he denies that he even knows Jesus. And he is so racked with grief and guilt over this that the scriptures tell us that he goes and he weeps all night because of what he has done. And so in this moment, Peter is convinced that his calling is over. And he returns to what he knew and what he came from. He goes back to fishing. And it might be that you're here today and there was a time in your life that you walked with Jesus, but then something happened. And you were disappointed. Or you messed up. And you're not walking with Jesus today because you don't feel like you're worthy to do so. And you've gone back to the life that you had before Jesus. You've gone back to the path that you used to walk, just like Peter did. Peter says to the other disciples, I go a-fishing. And that doesn't mean I'm going fishing tonight. It means I'm going back to fishing. I'm going back to the job, the calling I had before. I'm going back. And Peter is fishing. And someone calls to him from the shore and says, you got any fish? Hey, why don't you try over here? Peter recognizes that it's Jesus. He dives in the water and he swims the shore, and the rest of the guys bring the boat. And they sit there and they build a fire and they have the fish for breakfast. And Jesus talks to Peter and asks him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, you know I love you, Jesus. And he does it 3 times. And at the 3rd time, Peter recognizes that this is because he has denied Christ 3 times, and he's been asked 3 times, and his sin is right before him. And he is grieved that Jesus has asked him 3 times. And after Peter answers the 3rd time, Lord, you know that I love you, Jesus says, this will be your calling. And then he ends it with 2 words. Follow me. And what's beautiful about that, friend, what's incredible about that is that those are the same words Jesus said to Peter when he first met him. And what Jesus is saying to Peter in that moment is there is nothing that has happened that makes me feel any differently about you, Peter. Nothing that has happened that has ruined your opportunity to follow me. The invitation is still open. Follow me. Follow me. Friend, if you're here today and you're on the run, know that the invitation from Jesus is to stop running and walk with him. Follow him. Tim Keller said the resurrection is rational, it's personal, it's merciful, and because of that, it's wonderful. It's beautiful. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.